Hey guys, so by the time you're watching this video, I'll be on my flight to Vancouver for the YCS, so wish me luck. Anyways, I wanted to provide a tier list of the best rogue decks as usual, using Dueling Book data from YCS, as well as some event topping information, such as from regional level events, as well as the YCS that just happened in Brazil this past weekend. And before we continue, big thanks to my sponsors as always, links and discount codes in the description below. So this was the overall meta tier list by the data that I published just a couple of days ago, and so basically for this video we're only going to focus on rogue decks, so anything in tier 1 and tier 2 we will not be including, and I actually decided to just include Vanquish Soul as part of tier 2 as well. Alright, well let's just get to the rogue tier list for this month then, and we're going to start off with Tearlaments. I'm not really sure if this is also technically rogue. I mean, I could also definitely keep it open for tier 2 as well. I mean, I guess while it did have a few regional tops, it did not have any YCS tops, at least not yet, but you know, if you were to treat it as rogue, then it is an incredibly strong deck, just the type of board that it can provide, right? You know, it has access to like the Grapha Fusion, the new one, as well as like Barone for example, and you know, you have something like the Select for the negate, as well as, you know, Crime for a counter trap. It can definitely put up pretty impressive board, so you just kind of have to hope that you're not going to go against like Kashira or decks that you know, make use of Bestials a lot, or just any other kind of shifter decks, which essentially is kind of an issue with the current meta. Next we have Salamangreat, which is definitely a really strong rogue deck that's kind of found resurgence through that new support from Soul Burning Volcano. It's gotten a couple of regional tops so far as well, and you know, basically this is a deck that can have access to something like a counter trap as well as some multiple pops through the Rage, and you know, it is also a rank 4 toolboxy kind of deck, which means it can provide something like, you know, a Bistwaller or Baguska, which can be very devastating depending on the matchup, and because it being a cyber strategy, that the way it can link climb as well, and just having access to, you know, the update jammer access code combo line is also really good for going second and OTKing. And so next we have Infernoble Knight, and so I always say that, you know, if you're gonna play a rogue deck, playing a combo version of a rogue deck is just kind of always like the safest bet, just because, you know, in general in today's Yu-Gi-Oh, like if you're a deck that can go first and put up a formidable board, like it's really hard for any even meta decks to go second against, and Infernoble is a very clear example of that because of the type of board that it can provide going first. You know, multiple spell trap negates, it also has access to Barone, it has access to something like Gear Free for the additional monster negate, and so, you know, it does, as well as a pop as well from Charles, so you know, it can put up something really impressive and hard to break through. Dark Ruler is definitely kind of a kryptonite for this deck. They do have the Battling Boxer package to have access to a counter trap, but for the most part I think they're more so waiting on Age of Overlord for that Angel Ring equip to have a chance at dealing with Dark Ruler. So I think right now Rogue is a pretty fair assessment, but who knows, post Age of Overlord maybe it will actually at least enter into tier 2 conversations. So next we have Fluandereeze, which is a deck that can make use of Shifter very well, which can get you pretty far in this current format. And so, you know, it's a deck that's shown to be quite resilient. You know, even after losing Windberry Statue, it's been doing pretty well. I mean, post Duelist Nexus, I don't think it has had as much success as it did just in the past month, but I think the potential is still there. You know, not too much has changed realistically. It's also not special summon reliant, so you know, that can also be pretty handy in this meta as well. You know, let's say Rescue Ace, some of the builds have started to make use of Ibli, which really Flunder, they're not going to care, and you know, if Branded is still around, you know, the Gimmick Puppet again, that also doesn't matter for them, so it does have some pretty good advantages in the current meta as well. Moving on to the B tier, we do have Swordsoul, which is as solid as it comes, and I almost feel like it doesn't even matter what format we're in for Swordsoul, just because what they put up is kind of always just kind of like very standard. You know, you have like the Barone negate, Chi Shell monster negate, you have the blackout for multiple pops, as well as potentially maybe something else. It can also be pretty decent going second as well, just through like the Vishuda, like the Tenyi cards rather, and you know, something like Vishuda can bounce even like Floodgates, which can be pretty good. So let's say something like against like a Skill Drain, which you will probably see in this format still as well. So you know what, for a rogue deck, I think, especially considering how cost efficient it is to play this deck, it's a very good option to play if you're into rogue decks, as well as, you know, maybe even newer into Yu-Gi-Oh. I think it's a very good deck to start out with. So next we do have Marincess, which is one of the many cyber strategies in this rogue tier list. So I've already mentioned this in the overall meta tier list just a couple days ago, but you know, this deck is something that has actually had pretty good competitive success in the past half year or so, and you know, its end board is not necessarily like super oppressive or anything. It's you know, it can have like a spell trap negate. It has also like the trap you can play from hand for the imperm kind of effect and protection, as well as, you know, it can just play a lot of hand traps. So when you're a deck that can be as flexible as that, and like you can still hang around in like most formats as well. And then we also have another cyber strategy in Mathmech. I always say that this, I think, is going to be a really, really good rogue deck for quite some time to come. It's another deck that can play a lot of hand traps and actually can make even better use of hand traps than a lot of other decks, just because of, small world, and it can bridge into pretty much like every card in this deck as well. And so it's, win percentage wise, it's been doing quite well pretty much always. There's definitely some good dedicated Mathmech players out there. Regional level event wise, it's still getting some tops here and there. And you know what, like with this upcoming ban list, like either the Shifter or Bestials or Kashira in general, like at least one of those three is bound to get hit, right? So Mathmech, it can only look up and positive for this deck. Next we have Hero. This is another deck that I always kind of talk extensively in any of my videos, just because I do have multiple friends who are very, very dedicated to playing Heroes. And I was saying that, in this current format, let's say you have something like, Kashira, where they not only struggle with having a monster on board, which you can give with Dark Angel, but, also negating spells is kind of nice. I failed to mention in the last video how, Pearly, they do mostly play Relinquished Anima, so they can get around the Dark Angel, at least in that regard. At least, I guess they can't really shotgun things in the draw phase, though. But, one thing with Hero, though, Shifter is quite strong against this strategy, and to an extent Droll as well. So those are kind of popular cards depending on whatever top deck you're facing in this current meta, so definitely can be a challenge in that respect. But going first or second, Heroes has always been quite good. Like OTKing has been pretty easy for Heroes as well, and DP being able to constantly come back as well is pretty strong in a simplified game state. So next we have Rika, which honestly seems to have completely died off since entering Duelist Nexus. I mean, if you play Rika, certainly let me know in the comments why that's the case. I mean, in terms of the meta, has it changed that much? I mean, I guess we have like Unchained and Chimeras, some of the new decks that entered as top tier conversation. I'm not really sure that's exactly the reason why it's seeing a decline in play. Although among the small number of players that are playing, 58% win percentage is actually very, very good. And I'm sure Jess will find a way to bring this deck back into meta contention. Next we have Trap Tricks, which is definitely as rogue as it comes. Unfortunately, one of the weaknesses of this deck has always been just like its ability, or rather lack of ability, to be able to break boards going second, which I can kind of understand entering into this new Duelist Nexus format. Was probably challenging in terms of, let's say like Vanadium. Infernoble is another new kind of meta strategy that entered. I know it's kind of rogue, but those are like decks that can build up some really, really strong wombo heavy boards going first, which presumably is kind of hard for Trap Tricks. But at the same time, it's still getting a small number of regional tops so far, so there's hope. The hope is still there, so it's good to see. It's definitely the most cost efficient deck out of all of these decks that I'll ever list, so definitely a good one to start out for new players as well. Moving on to the C tier, we do have Adventure Synchron. Now, this is another deck that's been really big disappointment and has completely fallen off, especially in the last couple of weeks now. At least at the start of Duelist Nexus format, you were still seeing this. A lot of people were experimenting with it. I know it was kind of like a hand-ripped Omega kind of deck from what I recall. I also saw versions where they were using like the Calamity Lock, for example, through Crimson Dragon. But nonetheless, I think it hasn't really had that much success. I mean, it hasn't had any regional top 8 so far. That's at least publicly known. No YCS tops either, so disappointment so far. I mean, is the potential still there? I'm sure there is. I mean, perhaps I'm sure we'll at least see some regional tops moving forward, but I think so far it definitely does still belong in that rogue category. So next we have Altergeist, which is another deck that got some new support in Duelist Nexus, and honestly it's pretty solid. Like, I played against this at a regional level event, and it has like your standard like Hex GS spell trap negate that it always had, as well as like multi-faker through to Slickerous bounce, but now it has like a link that can also steal like your opponent's monsters. They do have some really strong back row as well that is can be hard to go through, especially when you're going second. But even when Altergeist player goes second and they can set multiple cards and then just pass, like that can still kind of get them back into it, especially with some powerful cards such as like Solemn Strike that they typically play. So what, cannot sleep on Altergeist. And then we have Dark Roll, which unfortunately in this current format, when most players are at least side decking Droll, which of course that is actually a trend in itself that might decline just because Vanadium isn't as like well played as it is in terms of top cut representation. Nonetheless, I think most players at the very least right now are playing it safe and still playing Droll, so which is very problematic for Dark Roll players. Not only that, we do still have Shifter in this format, which is also very strong against Dark Roll. So unfortunately not doing too well in terms of online play, just only 42% win percentage, and has not had any regional top 8s so far in this current format. So next we have Sky Striker, which unfortunately is another deck that is struggling quite a bit in terms of, win percentage, 41% online. And I think at this point, most players, I think they just kind of gave up on this deck now, with Engage coming to 2 and Multi-Roll coming to 3 on that last ban list. Even then, it did not do very well competitive-wise. I mean, it did have that one remote YCS top through my friend Dylan Fricker, but other than that, I think it's been pretty disappointing in terms of tournament level of success, especially in a format like now, let's say like Pearly, X-Pearly Noir, unaffected by activated effects, and Sky Striker probably would have a hard time dealing with that, and all of their cards also target, which in itself can also pose issues. And so, going second pretty hard in today's game, so I can see why the deck is still struggling. So next we have Dinos, and I believe the ones that actually finished top 8 in a couple of regionals were the combo Dino variants, which from my educated guess, before in the past, the combo version of Dinosaurs always involved like the scrap engine, would end on something like, let's say, like Appaloosa, Borload Savage, UCT, which serves as like a Book of Eclipse, which can be honestly pretty impressive. And of course, going second, UCT is always quite strong. And so certainly let me know in the comments if you play Dinos and how they are in the current format. I know they did get some recent support in Wild Survivors. I'm not sure if it was enough, but you know what, at least you're still getting some regional level success again. So next we do have Punk, and this is another deck that's definitely fallen off in the last couple of months. I know there was a Gold Pride deck that did top 8 regional in this Duelist Nexus format. I'm not exactly sure if that was a Gold Pride Punk variant, so certainly let me know in the comments if you are aware of that. I think, as a synchro strategy, I guess if you're going to play that kind of playstyle, you might as well play Vanadium. And not to mention, we do still have Droll kicking around in this format, which, it does have a pretty good impact against Punk. Then we have Exosister, which unfortunately is definitely falling off in terms of tiers, but who knows, maybe we can get Steven Santoli to start playing this deck again and sort of get it back up in terms of the rankings. It's another deck that can play Shifter, and it can also play certain floodgates, let's say like Gozen Match, which can actually be pretty impactful against something like Unchained, which is sort of like the new tier 1 strategy of the current format. And any deck that can play Shifter, honestly, you'll be able to do pretty well against most other strategies, except for, let's say, something like Kashtira. Next we have Plunder Patrol, and it actually had some regional top 8s as well, which is always good to see. I always think this deck is like super interesting, although I do think that for the most part they're probably played with the Runic engine still, and I personally found that if you can kind of handle the Runic side of things, like the board that Plunder Patrol puts up, it's not too difficult to go through, unfortunately, especially when Ash can be pretty versatile against this strategy, because like all of their ships, for example, that can serve as like a monster negate or monster banish or spell trap negate, they do have that clause where you can optionally draw if you have like like a whatever pirate attached to it. So Ash can be pretty strong in terms of interruption wise, so I do think that it's not the most oppressive deck to be able to go through, but nonetheless, I really do hope this deck continues to have some more success. So finally, we're moving into the last tier where we do have Dinomorphia. This deck did see some pretty good amount of play right after Cyberstorm Access, because it did get some new support there. I think nowadays it's not seeing that much play, but it did at least get one regional top 8 so far, which is nice to see. It is a pretty trap heavy deck. Its boss monster kind of almost serves as like a Mystic Mana of sorts, but in a format where you do have like something like Pearly and X-Pearly Noir, if players are still running something like Kaijus, for example, you can just like plop over it, and at least that big issue is kind of solved. So it's also a deck that does play a lot of cards at half your life points, so regional level event or higher, I can see kind of that could be a little bit risky in terms of time rules. And then finally, we have Super Heavy Samurai, of course, has fallen off quite hard ever since, it was meta for like 3 weeks, and the ban list kind of butchered this deck, and now more so used as like a package. I can only assume that with Droll still in this format, Super Heavy Samurai builds will probably still struggle against that kind of thing, as well as also something like, let's say, Dimension Shifter. But nonetheless, win percentage online, 57%, not bad, actually quite impressive, and also, at least having one regional top 8, so at least there's still some potential out there for you Pendulum / Super Heavy Samurai enjoyers. Now, some other rogue decks that I really wanted to include in this tier list, which actually have gotten some regional top 8 so far, are Mikanko and Scareclaw. Unfortunately, YGO in terms of Dueling Book data, just cannot seem to get any form of information on these two decks, unfortunately. Especially with Scareclaw, it's a little bit challenging because, any Vanadium deck list, they are going to play Scareclaw cards, so it definitely gets kind of hard to dissect those two cards apart, or two decks apart, rather. So these are two decks that I think are also very strong rogue contenders, and definitely something to watch out for as well. And that's it for the Rogue tier list by the data for this month. Hopefully it was interesting and helpful in terms of helping you choose the next Rogue deck to pursue for this new format. As always, a big thanks to all of you for watching. A huge thanks to my patrons as usual for the continued support. And hopefully I see some of you at YCS Vancouver. Take care, guys.